All right, so in the last video we left off noting that Socrates is going to inspect what the nature of justice is when it comes to the city so that he can get a grasp on the essence or form of justice and then see how that applies to what makes an individual just. Because remember, with the theory of forms, if they are both just, then they will both share in the essence of the form of justice and will thus have something in common, right? So we should be able to find that common thread. Okay, so what does the just city look like? Well, first, we need to know how the city is formed. And Glaucon was right in some respects, right? Contract theory seems to have at least one part of this idea correct. There are lives that are seemingly more valuable, and life in a society or cooperative group is supposed to be better than life in the state of nature. Why is this? Well, because none of us are self-sufficient, right? No individual person can complete all of the things they need to survive and thrive, right? You need somebody who knows something about farming and herding and cattle raising and animal health and human health, right? So you need doctors, veterinarians, people who can actually perform the day-to-day tasks, cobblers to make shoes, blacksmiths, so on and so forth, right? No one is completely self-sufficient in that way. So, because we need help, our self-interest drives us into cooperative groups, and that's why Socrates thinks that life in a cooperative group is just better than life in the state of nature, and that's why everybody should and does move toward a cooperative group. So what does this mean? Well, it means any city is necessarily going to have a working class. This is just obvious because we're coming together so that we can divide up the labor that needs to be done. So the city is definitely going to have a working class, and Plato calls this group the craftsmen. And then there's also going to be a second class, which Plato calls the guardians. And the guardians are the ones who introduce and enforce the rules of production and distribution. Right, so when you get all of these people together producing the goods that the city needs, but producing like just one part of all the goods that each individual needs, right? People are going to be left out of different goods, right? So if you spend all of your time as a blacksmith making weapons and horseshoes, so on and so forth, right, then you aren't doing any farming for yourself, and so there's going to have to be some trade or distribution of goods so that everybody gets their fair share. So here I just have a couple examples of things that the guardians might do, right? So they might make policies such as the following, right? 30% of the population does this job and they're paid this amount for that service. They could establish fair trade rates or a system of taxation and how everything gets distributed amongst the population, so on and so forth. And then the guardians also enforce all of those rules of production and distribution. So they don't just make the laws, they're also the enforcers. And we need this. We need this group in addition to the craftsmen, otherwise the city would sort of collapse on itself as there'd be no organization to the goods that everybody is producing. Okay. Now Socrates says when a city sort of keeps to just satisfying its needs, and when it satisfies the needs everybody has, not just their wants, right? That would be the healthy city. And there's no reason really to go much further if your city remains healthy, in that it's not striving for more than what's necessary. But as Glaucon and Adeimantus say, it's very clear that people desire these luxury goods. They don't just want to spend their entire life doing only what they need. They don't just want their basic needs satisfied. They want their desires for luxury satisfied. And so this means that the city's going to need a committed military class, right? Both for expansion. As the city grows, the population grows, the city will need to expand. As people want more luxury goods, our resources are going to need to expand. So we'll have to expand our land control for resource acquisition. And then we'll also have to have a committed military class because, look, we're amassing all of these luxury resources. We're going to need to protect these things. And he thinks out of the guardians, we're going to end up dividing them into two groups because some of those guardians are going to be more naturally fit for rule, and some are going to be sort of more naturally fit for the military. And so we divide the guardian class into both the rulers, clearly they're going to rule, and then the auxiliaries, who are the military branch. Those are the ones who enforce the rules. So at this part, we know every time we form a city that goes beyond just the necessities and the basic needs, there's going to be three classes in that city: the rulers, the auxiliaries, and the craftsmen. Okay. Now you might ask, and you should ask, how do we divide all of the people in the city into these three differing classes? And we could let them decide for themselves. We could hold a lottery, so on and so forth. How are we going to do it? What's the best way to do it? And Plato says we should divide people into their classes by their different natural latent abilities. So I think the flute player analogy we saw last week from the Protagoras is a good example of this, right? Protagoras said if you trained everybody in the city at flute playing, everybody was given the same education in flute playing, some would still be much better than others. Some would almost fail immediately, right? Some will never pick it up. Some will become experts. How does this make sense if they're all receiving the same training? Well, because some people are just naturally more adept for learning that skill. And so Plato thinks we should divide people among those natural abilities. If you don't buy the Protagoras argument, it seems like we have a bunch of other evidence of these things in the world, of different natural latent abilities. So here I have two NFL players, Sam Bradford and Tyler Eifert, who people claim are very injury prone. So why would this be, right? All of these players seem to be tight ends and quarterbacks take hits all the time, but they don't seem to always fall apart every time they get hit. But some players do seem to fall apart every time they get hit. What's going on there? Well, it's a genetic difference, right? It could be a freak accident. It could just be that these people are getting into worse collisions than everybody else. But it's more likely a genetic difference in the makeup of their body. So they're naturally more apt to be injured than another type of player without those genetic predispositions. Another way of thinking about these natural abilities is that there are millions of people out there who train just as hard as some of the pro players do, but they never end up making it into the NFL or the NBA or the MLB or whatever sport you're interested in, right? There are clearly people who train just as hard, some people who train even harder than the pros, but they never actually make it into the pro level leagues because they have a different natural potential, right? Their latent natural potential is just, unfortunately for them, less than other people in the world. And then if you don't like the sports analogies or the flute playing analogy, here's one that just seems pretty common sense, right? Most people have a natural predisposition in their K through 12 education where they lean one way or the other, either toward math or English courses, right? So you have a bunch of people who claim while they're going through high school, man, I suck at math, but I'm great at everything else. Or man, I suck at those English courses, but I'm killing the math courses, right? So there's a natural predisposition that these people have towards one or the other that makes them just naturally better at one or the other. It doesn't mean they can't be good at both, but they're naturally better at one than the other. Okay, so how does this relate to the state? Well, we need to divide people up according to those latent natural abilities. And so Plato believes that these different natural latent abilities will nicely divide into the three classes. Right, so if we find out what your natural ability is and you have no sort of political mind or no academic or intellectual mind, no military mind, but you have proclivity or natural predisposition for understanding architecture or building construction, then clearly you would be a craftsman in the city. If you happen to, we'll see this later, if you happen to have wisdom of justice, right, if you happen to have knowledge about justice, then clearly you should be within the ruling class. Right? This is difficult knowledge to come by, and so people who have a natural predisposition for wisdom should be the ones who rule. And people who have a natural predisposition for military-minded things and courage and physical attributes, so on and so forth, should be some of our auxiliaries or the military men. And so how are we going to find this out, though? That's a difficult question, right? Maybe you agree with Plato that everybody has these different natural abilities, but how are we going to find out what each of these things are? Well, Plato thinks that we need to put in place a rigorous education system that everybody gets sent through. And the entire point of this rigorous education system is that we give everybody both a training in literature, the physical arts, eventually in mathematics, and then in politics, and we see who makes it through all of these things and who by the end has sort of the best natural predisposition for ruling. And then they become the rulers. If you fall off before that, if you make it pretty much all the way through, but you just can't quite get a hold on what justice means, then you might end up in the auxiliary class. And then if you sort of, it doesn't have to be this way, but let's just say you drop out of school, right? You fail right from the get-go. Well, you're going to be in the craftsman class because you don't have the natural qualifications to take part in the ruling class. Now, one important thing here is that Plato thinks we need to restrict the content of our education in literature, right? So, for example, we don't want to train people based on stories that discourage virtue. Plato has a number of sort of inventive, sometimes pretty controversial policies he wants to put in place to make sure that the education system runs the way he wants it to run. And so you could spend the course of a week in this class just talking about Plato's goals and policies for implementing all of this stuff. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to do that here, but if you read through the Republic, you'll see there are a lot of different policies restricting education, sharing property between the auxiliary class to promote courage and take away from private possession, so on and so forth, right? So if you're interested in that, keep reading through the Republic. You can see how this education system really plays out. But for now, the most important thing to remember is that the education system is constructed with the goal of finding out what people's natural latent abilities are so we can figure out who should be the rulers of us. Okay, so we're finding out who has the natural ability to rule. Well, we should ask ourselves, what is the natural ability to rule, right? What type of expertise is that? What type of ability is that? Well, if you've been picking up on Plato's theory throughout the last 2 weeks, a good guess is that it's wisdom, right? So Plato is looking for those individuals who have a natural predisposition for the love of wisdom or philosophy. In other words, he wants those who have intellectual capabilities, those who are smart enough to exit the cave and come to knowledge of the forms, particularly the form of justice. He wants the people who have this intellectual disposition to be the ones who rule the state. And we will talk about why that is in the next video. Thank you.